Hello bookworms, it's Jade from Bedtime Bookworm and welcome back to my channel. Today I'm bringing you my July vlog style reading wrap up. For those of you that are new here, first of all, welcome. Secondly, I do my wrap-ups a little bit differently here. I do a mix between a reading vlog and a wrap-up. In the beginning, I do this overview introduction thing where I go over how my reading month went and maybe throw out a couple statistics, and then I will switch over to showing you some clips that I have filmed throughout the month where I talk about each of the books that I read shortly after finishing them. As usual, I will have timestamps down in the description box so that you guys can jump around and watch the parts of the video that you are most interested in. So first, I'm going to start with an overview of the month. I had what turned out to be a really good reading month. I wasn't sure it was going to turn out this way. At the beginning of the month, I definitely had a little bit of trouble juggling all the things that I was trying to do. In July, I was participating in Camp NaNoWriMo, and spoiler alert, I won, which means that I met my goal of writing a 6,000 word outline. I know the word count isn't a very high goal, but I hadn't completely plotted out my story either, so I spent a lot of the month figuring out what I wanted to do as well as writing those 6,000 words. I also bought Final Cut Pro this month, which is a video editing program. I had had my eye on it for a little while because I wanted to be able to do a little more than what I can do through iMovie. Actually, I was gifted this by my mother. She gave it to me as an early birthday present, so thank you, Mom. Anyways, I mentioned this because I got the program about halfway through the month. After that, I was like super obsessed with editing videos and just learning about how to use Final Cut Pro, and that really cut into a lot of my writing time and my reading time. So I am really impressed that I ended up reading 5 books this month, especially because 3 of them were over 500 pages. I read the most pages this month than I have so far this year. As far as ratings, I had 1 2-star book, 1 3-star book, and I had 3 5-star books. Like I said, I had a really good reading month. In these monthly wrap-ups, I go over the books that I read in the order that I read them. So the first book that I finished in July was Sky in the Deep by Adrienne Young, and this was an e-arc that I had received off of NetGalley or Edelweiss in exchange for an honest review. Next, I finished Seveneves by Neal, Stephenson, which was a book I read for my workbook club. Then I read Crooked Kingdom by Leigh Bardugo, which is the second book in the Six of Crows duology, and I read that as a buddy read with my friend Shoshana. Then I read A Crown of Swords, which is the 7th book in the Wheel of Time series by Robert Jordan, and I read this as part of my Wad-along or Wheel of Time read-along. And then I finished a book on the very last day of the month called Kill Creek by Scott Thomas. So if you want to hear my thoughts on these books, then stay tuned. Hello bookworms! So it is Saturday, July 14th, and I finished 2 books earlier this week. So the first book that I finished in July was Sky in the Deep by Adrienne Young. This was a YA sort of fantasy, but there's no magic. It's more of like an alternate historical fiction sort of, because it is a Viking-inspired world and culture, but it doesn't actually take place in our world. I mostly read this as an e-arc that I received from NetGalley or Edelweiss earlier this year in exchange for an honest review, but I also did take out a hardcover of the finished copy from my library and read out of that a little bit as well. I went into this with some medium expectations because I had heard some mixed things about it, and my overall feeling for it now that it's said and done is that it was just okay. It was pretty meh for me. I gave it 3 stars. There wasn't anything about it that I absolutely loved, but there also wasn't anything about it that I absolutely hated. So the story is about this girl, and in her village, every 5 years they have this really big battle that happens against this other village or clan. 5 years ago, when she participated in this battle for the first time, her brother died in that battle. Now it's 5 years later, and they go and have another one of their every 5-year battles, and she sees her brother there. Obviously, she's shocked because she thought her brother was dead, and then from there she goes on to find her brother and find out what happened to him. I thought that the clans and the world were interesting, but I also felt like everything was very surface level. I wish there had been more about why these 2 clans fight against each other every 5 years. The way that it was explained was just that it has always happened. It's like a blood feud. They always want to have revenge every 5 years, but I thought it was interesting that there was like such a timeline to it. that it happens like clockwork every 5 years. I just thought that was a little weird. I also just felt that the characters didn't have that much depth. They weren't completely flat, especially the main character. She definitely had some personality, just not as much as I would have wanted to get out of it. And that's basically my takeaway from this book, was that everything that was there was good. I just wish that there was more depth to the world building, more depth to the characters, more complexity to the plot. I think this is a debut book, and to me it read like a debut book. If the Viking inspired world sounds interesting to you guys, definitely check it out. That was my favorite part about it, but there wasn't enough to it for me to love it. It was just an average 3-star read for me. And then the next book that I finished this month was Seveneves by Neal Stephenson. I was reading this for a work book club. I'd heard a lot about Neal Stephenson before because he wrote Snow Crash. I've heard good things about that book, and so when it was selected for my work book club, I was excited to have an excuse to read it. I did happen to pick up a audiobook version of this and an ebook version of this from Amazon 6 months ago or so. They were having one of those sales, and I knew it was a possibility that I might be reading this for book clubs. So those sales are always my downfall. Anyways, I mostly ended up listening to this, although I did read the ebook a little bit. Man, guys, this was such a disappointment for me. If I hadn't been reading this book for a book club, I would very likely have DNF'd it about 30% in. Seveneves is what I would call hardcore science fiction. It's kind of like a post-apocalyptic story that turns into a little bit of a space opera. The very beginning premise of this book is that the moon explodes, and then after a couple of years, the Earth is no longer inhabitable. Humans start making plans for how humans are going to survive, and so they start building a spaceship. I don't really know how to talk about this because this book was so complicated. I guess I'll just start with things that I liked and then talk about the things that I didn't like. So this book has a lot of really good ideas. I really like the idea of the moon exploding and how that would affect the Earth, and I love that Neal Stephenson was very scientific when it came to figuring out how humans would actually survive, and that's basically the only thing that I liked about it, were the ideas. The execution did not work for me. The pacing of this was all over the place. I thought the first half of the book was so slow. Neal Stephenson, like I said, is very scientific, but he also is super descriptive about the science and goes on for pages and pages on how physics work and how the humans were going to survive. And this is coming from someone who likes science, although I will say I am more of a biologist. First half is very physics heavy. It reminded me a little bit of The Martian and how scientific that book was, except that The Martian was funny and Seveneves doesn't really have that much humor. In the second half, he does go into a lot of genetic biology, which was super interesting. At least the ideas presented there were super interesting. They weren't all that plausible, which one of the reasons why we wanted to read this for book club is I work for a genetics company, so my book club understood a lot of the ideas and the genetics behind what Neal Stephenson was trying to do in the book, but that doesn't even get going until the second half of the book. I remember really struggling from 30% to 50% because I was just so bored out of my mind. Honestly, if I wasn't, well, one, reading it for book club, but two, if I hadn't been listening to it on audio while I was doing other things, I would not have gotten through this book. However, things do get a lot more interesting once you get to the 50% mark, maybe even like 45%. Another big con to this book was that I wasn't able to connect to any of the characters. I felt like all of the characters in this book were very surface level. You don't really get to know them all that well. You don't really get inside their heads. There's definitely a disconnect between the reader and the characters in this book, and that's a big reason why it didn't work for me as well. I've always thought that I was mostly a plot-based reader, but what this book really helped me to realize is that I need both. I need a good plot. I can't have just interesting characters, but I also need the characters to be at least a little bit interesting and relatable. I need to be able to empathize with them in some way, otherwise I just have zero interest in reading about them. I think what I felt about this book as a whole was that everything was very surface level. I felt like there was a lot of good ideas that he was trying to tackle, but he just didn't go as in depth into those ideas as I would have wanted. Same with the characters. I wish that there was more depth to the characters, especially the last third of this book. It's like completely different from the rest of the book, and I feel like it would have done a lot better as a sequel, where he could have really gone more in depth into the world that he was setting up and the characters. There was politics going on in that last third that I just really had a hard time grasping because it was done so quick and it was such a short amount of the book. So yeah, overall, I was really disappointed. It just had a lot of good ideas, but the execution didn't work for me. I don't know if I'm going to try a Neal Stephenson again, just because the writing style was so not for me. If you guys have read any Neal Stephenson that you really like, definitely leave it down in the comment section, let me know, and maybe I'll give him a second shot with a different book. I really struggled with the rating. I originally gave it a 3-star rating because I had such mixed feelings about it. I really liked the ideas he was trying to explore, but now that I've had more time away from the book, I finished it like 3 days ago, I think I'm going to drop it down to a 2-star rating. If I really go with my gut, I didn't enjoy my experience reading this, and my star ratings are mostly about my enjoyment. So yeah, I think I'm going to settle on a 2-star rating for Seveneves. Even though it had a lot of really interesting ideas, it just wasn't executed in a way that I enjoyed. Okay, so those are the 2 books that I've read so far in the month, and I will check in with you guys when I have finished another book. Bye. Hey bookworms, it is close to the end of the month. Today's the 28th. I have 2 more books to tell you about. Earlier this week, I finished Crooked Kingdom by Leigh Bardugo, which is the second and last book in the Six of Crows duology. I have been wanting to read this book for a really long time. It has been high priority all year, and I finally got around to it thanks to my friend Shoshana. She was like, okay, we just need to do a buddy read of this so that we can both read this book. And that's what we did. We did a buddy read. I read this book physically. I own a hardcover copy of it. I really wanted to listen to the audiobook. I hear it's really great because it has a full cast recording, and I actually have never listened to a full cast recording. But unfortunately, the audiobook is only an Audible exclusive, and I just wasn't quite ready to bite the bullet and buy the audiobook, so I just read it physically, which is totally fine because I already owned the physical book. I might as well read out of it, right? Overall, I really enjoyed this ending to the duology. I personally think Leigh Bardugo does endings really well. I loved the ending of her Grisha series, which I know had mixed receptions. I remember being a sobbing mess at the end of that book. While the ending of this one didn't make me sob quite as hard as the ending of the Grisha series, I still shed a decent amount of tears. I'm sure most of you are familiar with what Six of Crows is about, but basically this is set in the same world as the Grisha series, but it's set in a different part of the world. The series is about this ragtag group of misfits that are all very morally gray. In the first book, they're trying to pull off a heist. In the second book, they're dealing with some of the repercussions of that heist, as well as basically pulling off another heist. I love books about heists and cons. If you guys really like stories about cons, I recommend checking out Sneaky Pete, which is a TV show. I think it's on Amazon Prime. It's all about this con man, and I love it. I love it so much. Anyways, I grew very attached to all of the characters in the first book. The second book goes on to making these characters even more endearing. I thought Leigh Bardugo did such a good job of balancing plot progression and character depth. We get a lot more backstory into each of the characters in this book. There's flashbacks, and we just learn more about their history, but it's paced well where there's still interesting plot things happening in between those character development moments. So one thing that I love about this book and this series that I don't really hear people talking a lot about is the fact that economics plays such a big part in the con and the heist that these guys are doing. I noticed it more, I think, in the second book than in the first one, where they're talking about like the market and how and why the market fluctuates, why people would want to invest at certain points and things like that. But it's set in this unique and interesting fantasy world at the same time. What I love about this is that when I was a teenager and early adult, I didn't know anything about investing, about the stock market. All of that stuff seemed very intimidating. As an older adult now, as someone who has a 401k and has learned a little more about investing since then, I wish I had had a book like this that introduced me to those types of ideas in a setting that I enjoy, that doesn't feel like learning. I love that this is a book for teenagers and for them to be able to be introduced to those concepts so that when they do get older, the idea of investing in the stock market isn't that scary. That's probably like a really weird pro for this book, and I've definitely never heard anybody talk about it before, but I loved that aspect of this book. Another thing is that I want to give a content warning for this book for substance abuse and addiction, because there is one character who is dealing with that in this book, and some of the descriptions of her symptoms I thought were very visceral and I could see as being triggering for some people. Something a lot of people do talk about as a pro for this book is the diversity. There's definitely diversity in body types and abilities or disabilities, as well as sexual orientation and things like that. All kinds of diversity in this book, and it's not done in a way that to me felt like Leigh Bardugo was trying to check off specific boxes. It was all very natural and made these characters just seem that much more real. I did have a couple of small issues with this book. I'd say as far as the heist or the con they're putting on, that part of the plot in this one was a little less exciting. And I think this is because in the first book, I had no idea what to expect. I didn't know, what these characters were capable of. But after seeing what they're capable of in the first book, almost everything that goes wrong in the second book, you're not really worried about the characters figuring out a way around it. You just know that they're so capable that I just felt like everything was going to be fine. There was also a really slight issue I had with one of the characters, something that they did with their power. I just felt like there was a little bit of a plot hole there, or it was just a little unbelievable for me. I can't be more specific, obviously, because of spoilers, but suffice it to say that there was like a little plot issue that I had, but overall, it didn't take away from my enjoyment of the book. It just made me kind of like scratch my head like, what? But I got over it pretty quickly. All of that being said, I kind of struggled between a 4 and a 5-star rating for this book. I'd say about 60 to 70% through the book, I was leaning towards a 4-star, but then that last bit, and like I said, Leigh Bardugo, I think, does fantastic endings, and now I've landed on a 5-star rating. If I was doing half-star ratings, it'd probably be a 4.5, but it most definitely rounds up to a 5-star, so I'm giving Crooked Kingdom 5 stars. And then the next, and probably the last book that I am reading this month, because there's only a few more days left, was of course the Wheel of Time book for the Watch-Along for July, and that was A Crown of Swords, which is the 7th book in the Wheel of Time series by Robert Jordan. I read this one, guys, in like practically a span of a week, maybe a little bit longer, but the second half of it I read within 48 hours because your girl was running behind, and boy, did I love this book. So far in the series, my favorite has been the 4th book, and I think the 7th book has taken that spot now. So this was the first book that I've read during this reread that I really did not remember the things that happened. The last couple of books I was starting to have a few surprises that were exciting, but this book, I swear I didn't remember like half the scenes in it. So I'm not sure if it made it into my favorite spot at this point because it just felt like such a new and fresh read, but some really cool and exciting stuff definitely happened in this book. I thought the pacing was so much better than it has been for the last two. I don't think I felt like the pace was lagging at any point. Everything that happened, I thought, kept the plot progressing forward. I mostly listened to this on audio, although a lot of it I was reading and listening at the same time because that's actually how I can read the fastest. The narrators just really shone in this book. I mean, they're good in every book that I've read in this series, but there are multiple points in this specific book where they were doing different voices for different characters, and I was just repeatedly impressed with the way that they were voicing the characters. Especially Kate Reading, the female narrator. She has so many voices, and she's so good with her inflection and portraying emotions. I just thought she was fantastic. I mean, she always is, but I definitely noticed it in this book. I really think that's all I'm gonna say about A Crown of Swords. I'm trying to think what other like vague, non-spoilery things I can say, but I think that's about it. I will be doing a spoiler-free book review as well as a spoiler-filled book diary for this book. So if you are a Wheel of Time fan, definitely check out those videos because you'll get some more of my in-depth thoughts. Alright guys, those are the two books that I have read since the last time I checked in with you. I really don't think I'm going to be finishing any more books before the end of the month because it's already the 28th. And as of today, I finished everything that I was reading, so I'm going to be starting a new book or two from here. Bye. Hello, bookworms. So I was actually able to squeeze in one more book before the end of July. I read this book so quickly. I finished it in 4 or 5 days, which for me is really, really fast. That book is Kill Creek by Scott Thomas. Around mid-July, for some reason, I started being in a horror or thriller mood. I was in the middle of reading other things that I needed to be reading, but I did go to Twitter and ask for some recommendations, hoping that would quench my thirst for some horror or thriller just by adding it to my TBR on Goodreads. I did end up buying a couple books, and one of those books was Kill Creek. There was a bundle deal for ebook and audiobook together. I was recommended it by Sean from Eclectic Reads, and I'd also heard Stephanie from That's What She Read talk about it as well. After I had finished all the books that I had planned to finish in July, I was like, this is the perfect time. I can read it now. Even though it wasn't on my TBR that I made earlier this summer, I'm allowing myself at least one book a month, so 3 books out of the season to read outside of that TBR, so this was going to be one of those books. Even though it had been recommended to me by a couple people and I'd heard people talk about it, I'm really surprised at how much I liked it. Kill Creek is a horror paranormal story. It's basically about a haunted house, Going into it, I thought that the majority of the story would be set in the house, but that's not actually true. While the house plays a major role in the story, it isn't the only setting of the story. So this is a story about 4 different horror writers. They write very different types of horror, and they get invited to do an interview at this haunted house. While I've watched a lot of horror movies, I haven't read a lot of horror. I've only started dabbling in reading horror over the past year or so, and I haven't read a story about a haunted house before. Like I said, I inhaled this book. I read it over 4 or 5 days. When I wasn't reading it, I wanted to be reading it. I could not stop thinking about it. I wanted to know what was going to happen next. After reading the synopsis, I knew that the story was going to be about authors, but I didn't realize how meta about writing the book was going to be. So there is a lot of stuff in here about like an author's process and how people write differently and write for different audiences and struggling with writing. That kind of stuff was in here that I wasn't expecting, but I really enjoyed that aspect of the book. It reminds me a little bit of Stephen King, just in the sense that I feel like Stephen King writes a lot of authors and writers into his stories, but not in the writing style or anything like that. I really liked all of the different characters. They all had really interesting character arcs. The ending was so good, and it literally gave me goosebumps at the end. This book gave me so much anxiety while I was reading it. It's really interesting to me because I, in real life, have anxiety, and I would say in general that I get scared pretty easily, but I love scary movies and I love getting scared, and I don't understand why, because it does give me the same sort of anxiety feelings that I don't like when it applies to my real life. It's almost like I'm channeling my anxiety in a different direction or something, and it's for some reason really fun to get stressed out by scary books and scary movies. There are multiple moments in this book where my heart was pounding so fast and I was so stressed out. I don't know why that's fun, but it was fun. I'm really impressed that this was a debut book. I think that Scott Thomas is up for an award or something for this being a debut book. I definitely see why. Also, I mostly listened to this on audio. The narrator is fantastic. I didn't look it up to see who the narrator was, but I'll put it on the screen. I was super impressed with this narrator. I think he is definitely a reason why I read this as quickly as I did and why I enjoyed it as much as I did. There are multiple moments where, you know, there's people whispering or there's people yelling or like they're supposed to sound crazy, you know, things that happen in horror books, and he just voiced all of those things so well. I was majorly impressed with the narration, and if you want to read this book, I definitely recommend reading it on audio, although I think that adds a little bit to that creep factor, but if you like the creep factor as much as I do, then that's definitely the way to go for this book. Alright guys, those are all of the thoughts that I had for Kill Creek. Oh, I guess I didn't say what I rated it. I rated it a 5 out of 5 stars. I can't think of any particular things in this book that I would want to change. I had a blast reading it, and I thoroughly enjoyed this book, so definitely a 5-star rating for me. Alright, that is all I've got for you guys today, and I will see you guys next month. Bye. Alright guys, those are all of the books that I read this month. I was really surprised to be able to finish Kill Creek like right at the end of the month. I was not expecting that when I first picked it up. If you like this video, be sure to give it a thumbs up and subscribe to my channel if you like bookish content. I post 1 to 2 times a week. That is all I have for now. Thank you so much for watching, and until next time, bookworms, keep reading. Bye.